Hi kids, it's time for the Bible and you. And today's episode is, I hope you found episodes 1 to 10 useful and interesting, and I'm really happy to see you again in episode 11. And in this episode, we're going to look at the book of Leviticus. So the book of Leviticus is not something that's considered to be a very interesting or a favorite book among many believers and Christians, but that's what we're going to look at today. And the book of Leviticus is actually the third book in the Bible, and it lies in the middle of the first 5 books. So the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, together these 5 books form the Pentateuch. Penta means 5 and Tuch means book. So these 5 books together, they form the Pentateuch. And all of these 5 books in the Pentateuch were written by Moses, and it was written by Moses to the Israelites. So the audience here is the Israelites and the author is Moses. And the book of Leviticus actually lies in the middle of the Pentateuch as the third book. And it's actually a very important book to understand how things used to work in the old covenant that we've talked about for the past couple of episodes, and how Jesus changed all of that in the new covenant by dying on the cross for our sins. So first of all, before we go into detail about this book, we need to think about what is the main theme of the book, what is the purpose for which it was written, and who was it written to. So the main theme of the book, throughout the book, if you read the book of Leviticus, the recurring theme is that God is holy and he cannot be in the presence of anything that is unholy. And that's what God repeatedly says. He says, the Lord your God is holy, and that line gets repeated quite a number of times across the book. The second thing is the purpose for which this book was written. So this book has a lot of laws that Moses has recorded from God. So God gave the Israelites a lot of laws that they should live by so that they can be temporarily pure or temporarily holy, so that they can be in God's presence without being killed or without dying in God's presence. So first of all, that raises a question: if God's presence is good, how can it cause people to die? Right? So the thing is, God's presence is so holy that anything that is unholy or unclean cannot be in that presence, and it cannot be alive in that presence. So an example that's used a lot to describe this is that God's presence is like, God is like the sun, and God's presence are like the rays that come from the sun. And if anything, the sun is good. It gives light, it gives heat, it gives life to people who live in this world. But if anything gets really close to the sun, if anything goes too close to the sun, anything corruptible, so anything man-made or any human beings, if they go too close to the sun, they die. So although the sun is a good thing, with the corruptible bodies that we have, if we get too close to the sun, then we can't survive the heat of the sun. The same way, even though God's presence is good, with our corruptible mortal bodies, with its impurities and uncleanness and sins, we cannot go into God's presence without being destroyed. So because of this, God wanted his people to be able to come near him and to draw near him. And so because of this, God creates a list of rules and regulations that the people need to follow so that they can be pure enough to be in God's presence. So this is not a permanent solution, but every time the people want to go into God's presence, they need to make sure that they're holy and they're fit to enter God's presence. So these gave rise to a bunch of laws, which are all given in the book of Leviticus, and we can divide these laws into 3 main sections. So the book of Leviticus has 27 chapters, which can be divided into 3 sections. The first section are chapters 1 to 7 and chapters 23 to 27. So both these portions of the book, they give laws about, they consist of ritual laws, so things that the Israelites need to follow. And the second section is rules on priesthood, and this is covered in chapters 8 to 10, that's the first section, and chapters 21 and 22, and that's the second section. And within these 2 sections, God covers the rules of priesthood. The third portion, or the third section that the book can be divided into, is purity laws. And this is given again from chapters 11 to 15 as the first portion and 18 to 20 as the second portion, and both these portions give instructions on purity laws. And then in the middle of the book, chapters 16 and 17, which is right in the middle, consists of it explains something called the Day of Atonement, which we'll come to in the end, after we look through all of these different sections of the book. So if we look at the first section of ritual laws, that would be chapters 1 to 7. And this talks about one particular kind of ritual. So it talks about sacrifices and how to offer sacrifices, what kind of sacrifices to offer, under what circumstances these sacrifices need to be offered, how they need to be offered, and what they mean. So if you read through Leviticus chapters 1 to 7, you will come across different descriptions of how sacrifices have to be made. And there are different kinds of sacrifices. Some sacrifices are there to say, I'm sorry, because the people have committed sin, and this includes sacrifices like burnt offerings, sin offerings, and things like that. And then there are other offerings that are other sacrifices that are given to say thank you to God, and this includes grain offering, drink offering, and grain offering, meal offering, and things like that. So I won't go into too much detail here, but you can read this in your own time, and you'll see that every chapter has different kinds of sacrifices described and how they need to be offered, how the priests need to deal with them, what the people need to offer as part of the sacrifice, so on and so forth. And then the second part of ritual laws are given at the end of the book, and this is between chapters 23 and 27, and this covers ritual laws to do with celebrations and festivals. So the point of this is to remind the people what God has done for them from the time that they left the land of Egypt. So to give an example, if you remember, when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, God put 10 plagues on the Egyptians to make them let the Israelites go free. And the 10th plague is the most special one because it is something that the Israelites remember every year and they celebrate every year, and this is the death of the firstborn. So God tells the Israelites that He will send the angel of death to destroy all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. And for the Israelites to be protected from the angel of death, they had to kill a lamb and put the blood of that lamb on the doorposts and on the lintel and the doorpost. And when the angel of death sees the blood, he will not touch anyone in that family, and he will pass over that house. And this was this was celebrated every year by the Israelites as a festival called the Passover, that reminds them that the angel of death passed over them because he saw blood on their door. So this festival was to remind the Israelites that God protected them and He delivered them and redeemed them from Egypt, from being slaves. God freed them from slavery in Egypt, and He brought them out. And He brought them to the promised land. So there are a lot of different kinds of festivals, other festivals that are also mentioned in this portion of the book, and each of which is a reminder of how God has been faithful in keeping His promise to the nation of Israel. That's the second part of the ritual laws that we can see in the book of Leviticus. So if we move on to the second section, which is the laws of priesthood, the first portion of this is given in chapters 8 to 10. And here, this describes the laws of how to ordain a priest, how a priest should be ordained, who can be ordained, who is eligible, and things like that. So it starts off by describing the story of how Aaron and his sons were ordained, and then it gives rules about who is fit to be a high priest. There are a lot of criteria about who can and who cannot be a high priest, and all of this is described in this part of the book, and it also explains what needs to be done when a priest has to be ordained for the ministry of a high priest. So that's what that portion of the book covers. There is a second portion of rules of priesthood which are given in chapters 21 to 22, and this talks about rules of how priests should live. So if you remember from our episodes on high priest, I mentioned that the priests have to stand between God and the people, and they have to mediate, in a way, between God and the people. They have to offer sacrifices for the people to God, and they have to stand before God on behalf of the people. So this means that the priests work very closely with God's presence. So the people will be outside the temple, or they can come up to the outer court, up to the altar, but it's only the priests that get to go into the tabernacle of meeting or into the temple and into the holy and the most holy places. Because of this, the priests were expected to have a higher standard of holiness or higher level of holiness to the way they lived, because they worked so close with God. And so because of this, God gave a specific set of rules as to how priests should live. And with regards to everything, what they wear, what they eat, who they marry, and all those sort of rules, and how they mourn when someone dies in the family, all of these rules are given in this section of the book. And this is just to set the priests apart and say, you work very closely with God, and so you need to have a higher standard of living compared to the rest of the people. So finally, the final section of the book of Leviticus are the sections that describe the purity laws. So the first section of purity laws are given in chapters 11 to 15. And these describe something called, these distinguish something called a clean state and an unclean state, or a pure state and an impure state. What this basically means is that so when the people come before God, it's not just the mistakes that they do that make them unfit to stand before God. There are other things that can make them impure or unclean, and that will stop them from coming into God's presence. This includes eating unclean animals. So God gives a list of animals that the Israelites are allowed to eat, and a list that they're not allowed to eat. And then rules about bodily fluids, rules about leprosy, rules about childbirth, all these sort of things are given in this portion of the book. And God basically describes to the people what would make a person unclean and what would keep them clean. And so they had to follow these rules. So if anyone was unclean, they were not allowed to enter into God's presence. In some cases, if a person has leprosy, for example, they were not allowed to stay in the camp, because anyone who touches them would also become unclean, and so they had to live outside the camp by themselves. So this portion talks about clean and unclean things. So it's a set of purity laws that just talk about a clean and unclean state of the people of Israel. So it's not a sin. It wasn't a sin to break these laws, but if anyone did break these laws, they could not enter into God's presence. So the second set of purity laws are given in chapters 18 to 20, and these describe moral purity. So this is not to do with what makes us outwardly clean or unclean, but it's about the way that the Israelites were expected to live. So I've mentioned in previous episodes that God chose the Israelites as his own special people, and because of this, they were expected to be have a higher level of purity than the nations that lived around them. So God expected them to have a higher standard of morals than the other nations that lived around them. So God gave instructions on, how they should be good people. Basically, that's what the moral laws teach the people. So if they were to lend money, how they should treat the person that borrowed from them. If they went into war and captured some people as slaves, how they should deal with them. And how they should respect the elderly, they should respect their parents, this sort of thing. So it's more about how the nation of Israel had to follow these rules to become, to be a nation that reflects God. So all of these all of these rules that God gives, the moral rules or the moral laws that God gives, reflect the kind of person that God is, right? So God is a good God. He doesn't treat anyone badly. He doesn't put anyone down, this sort of thing. So God expected his people to be just like he is. So he expected his people to be good to others. He expected his people to be compassionate. He expected his people to be just and to reflect his characters by following these moral laws. So this is why the moral law is very, very, very important. And if you actually look back at the time period that this was given, all the other nations were very ruthless, and the rules that God gave the Israelites was somewhat revolutionary, because none of the other nations even remotely did anything like this. So they didn't care about their slaves. They didn't care about the people that they captured in war. They didn't care about people who borrowed from them. They used to torture them and oppress them. But that's not what God expects of his people. He sets a higher standard for them and says, no, look, this is how you need to be, because you need to be like me, because you are my people. And that is what the moral laws are all about. So that's the second set of purity laws. So before we head on to talk about the Day of Atonement, let's quickly summarize what we looked at so far, because otherwise I think there's too much to keep in mind. So the laws in the book of Leviticus can be divided into 3 different sections. The first section consists of ritual laws. The second one consists of priesthood laws. The third one is the purity laws. And each of these sections exists as 2 portions in the book of Leviticus, one in the beginning and one at the end, and it's like a mirror. So the first set of ritual laws are about the sacrifices that the people of Israel were expected to offer. The second set of ritual laws were about celebrations that God expected the people of Israel to follow. The second set of ritual laws are about celebrations that God expected the Israelites to follow as a reminder of what God has done for them in the past. And then the second portion is the second section is the priesthood laws. And in the first portion of the priesthood laws, we see that God gives rules about how to ordain a priest, who can be a priest, and it's all to do with ordination of priests. The second section of priesthood laws is about how the priest should live, so rules of living for the priests. The third final section of the book of Leviticus consists of purity laws, and the first portion of purity laws are about clean and unclean things. What is clean, what is allowed, and what is unclean, and what is not allowed. It also talks about bodily fluids, life and death, and childbirth, and that sort of thing, and some kinds of skin diseases and things like that. And then the second set of purity laws is about moral purity. So it's about how the Israelites should live and how they should reflect God in the way they live, and they should have a higher standard of living to the nations that are around them. Okay, so that's all the sections in the book of Leviticus done. The final section that's left are chapters 16 and 17, which describe a very important day, which is why it's in the middle of the book, the Day of Atonement. So you might have heard about this before. I think I may have mentioned it in a previous episode, but I'll explain this in a bit more detail in this one, and which will help us to understand how Jesus comes into the picture. So the Day of Atonement was a day that was set once in a year on a specific day, and God gives a specific month and a day when this was to be followed year after year. So it was once a year, every year. And the thing about the Day of Atonement, I mean, if you think about why do the Israelites need a Day of Atonement, is that sometimes, even touching a dead body or, touching someone who had a skin disease could make someone unclean. And they may not realize that they've touched the person or they've touched a dead body. And they might be unclean, but they might not know it. So if anyone realized that they've committed a sin, then they had to offer a sacrifice at the temple straight away. But if they didn't realize, then they had to offer a sacrifice on the day that they realized. But if they never realized at all, then these sins were dealt with on the Day of Atonement. So this is for sins which were committed or, unknowingly without realizing, and the people never realized it until the end that they made that mistake. So these sins were dealt with on the Day of Atonement. And this is what would happen. All of the children of Israel or the people of Israel would gather at the tabernacle of meeting, and there would be 2 goats that would be brought into the temple, and Aaron would sacrifice one of the goats. One of the goats would become a sin offering. So one of the goats would be killed and offered as a sacrifice. And then the second goat that they bring was called a scapegoat. So you might have heard this word used before, but this is basically where it comes from. So the second goat was called a scapegoat, and Aaron, or the high priest who lived at that time, would put his hands on the head of that scapegoat, and he would recite all the possible sins that could have been committed by the people of Israel. So that's every single sin that you can think of. He would recite it over that goat, and then they would take that goat outside of the camp or outside of the city, and they would set it free in the wilderness, and it would roam around in the wilderness for the rest of its life, carrying the sins of the Israelites. And then the first lamb that was killed, Aaron or the high priest would take that blood and go into the most holy place with a censer of incense, and he would sprinkle the blood before the Ark of the Covenant and get forgiveness from God for the sins that the people have committed unknowingly. So this is what would happen on the Day of Atonement, and that was the only day that the high priest was allowed to enter the most holy place, as I mentioned in the previous episodes. So this was a very important incident, a very important day for the Israelites, which is why it has its own section. It's not, included in the celebrations or in the sacrifices. It stands alone in the middle of the book. And the reason it's so important is because that was the day that everyone's sins were forgiven, at least for that year, right? Before the next Day of Atonement would come. But we don't follow, no matter but no matter how many laws and rules and regulations God gave the Israelites, none of these laws were enough to make people perfect. So this is what I mentioned in the episode about the Old and the New Covenant, that the law of Moses could not make anything perfect. That's what we read in the book of Hebrews. So all of these rules and regulations that the Israelites followed could not make them perfect enough to stand before God. They still needed a priest to come and stand and pray for them and to sacrifice for them and to mediate between them and God. They could not enter into God's presence themselves. So this is where Jesus comes in. So we don't follow sacrifices. We don't do all these celebrations. We don't follow, we don't anoint priests or high priests, and we don't follow all of these purity laws anymore. So how is it that we are able to enter into God's presence? The reason is that all of these laws were fulfilled in Jesus. So Jesus says this a lot in the New Testament. He says, I have come to fulfill the law and the prophets. The reason is he did do that. So when Jesus died on the cross, he became our sacrifice, so he fulfilled the ritual laws there. He is the reason we celebrate our victory over sin. So again, the second part of the ritual laws are fulfilled there. He is our high priest forever, and that fulfills the laws of priesthood. And he does not need to follow the rules of priesthood because he is sin-free. So that fulfills the second portion of the priesthood laws. So when Jesus was alive, he said, he made it clear that food could not make us clean or unclean. And so that whole section about clean and unclean things, about bodily fluids and things like that, everything is finished with Jesus. So when we come to Jesus, we are delivered from all of those things, and we don't need to follow any of that anymore. So the purity laws are out. And finally, we have the moral purity laws. And the thing is, when you follow Jesus' standards of moral living is a lot higher than what was set by Moses. So what Moses said in his in the law of Moses was actually, in the book of Leviticus, was actually quite a low standard. So Jesus talks about this in the New Testament, and he says that it's the level of expectation that Jesus had from his followers is actually a lot higher. And we don't need to be worried about that, because when we follow Jesus, he makes us like him, and he sanctifies us. So I mentioned this in before in a previous episode, that when God looks at us, he doesn't see our shortcomings and our sins anymore. He sees the blood of Jesus that has covered us. So when we stand before God, he doesn't see us as sinners. He sees the perfectness of Jesus on us, and Jesus has taken our sins on the cross. So when God looked at Jesus on the cross, he saw our sins on him and Jesus' righteousness on us. So Jesus becomes our righteousness, so there is no place for the purity laws either. And the most important thing, the Day of Atonement, the final Day of Atonement and the final sacrifice that was given was when Jesus died on the cross for our sins. So we read in the book of Hebrews that there is no need for another sacrifice, because the ultimate sacrifice has already been made by Jesus. And so we can see that now that Jesus has died on the cross, anyone who believes in Jesus does not need to worry about following all of these rules given in the book of Leviticus anymore. So I mentioned in a previous episode that Jesus frees us from slavery to the law, right? Because if you were to follow all of these rules, it's going to be impossible to do anything, because there are so many rules about what you eat, what you wear, how you live, about pretty much anything you can think of. There is a rule or a law about it. So anyone who lives by the law is living under slavery, because there is no freedom to do anything. But Jesus has freed us from slavery to the law, and he has become our righteousness. He has become our high priest, and he has become our sacrifice. And because of this, we do not need this just confirms to us that the law of Moses could not make anyone perfect, but faith in Jesus Christ makes those who come to him perfect before God.